That's kind of conversation between the soul. That's conversation between the soul and the mind.
Hello, Prestige heads, and welcome to American Prestige. I'm Danny Bessner, here as always with my friend and comrade Derek Davison, and we're very excited to welcome to the podcast today Peter Slezkine. Peter's a senior fellow and director of the Russia program at the Stimson Center, and he's also host of the Trilogue podcast. I actually guested on that, and Peter, I don't know if you know, but I'm the most downloaded episode of the Trilogue podcast. So if people want to have an entry into that, check out my episode. Me and Peter yell at each other, as I hope we'll do here. And there's also a bunch of excellent interviews with people who are really experts in U.S. foreign relations, Russia, and the like. So we've invited Peter because he's just actually gotten back from Russia. I'm talking literally this week, and we want to talk to him about what that was like. So, Peter, I guess my first question is, you met with Putin...
Danny, I'm sorry. Can I jump in before you ask your first question? I just wanted to know, were you able to get Danny's sanctions lifted?
Well, Derek, that was my first question. I was going to say, when he met with Putin,
I'm glad we're on the same wavelength.
What did I say? What did
were
he
you
have
able to
say
get Danny off the Russian blacklist
about my unjust
the relevant
sanctions
situation here?
Yeah, so, Peter, what did Putin say?
You're asking me to reveal the level of my Russian connections, which might get me in trouble in Washington.
Yeah, which we would never want to do. But I guess
the question of your status did come up, and
naturally,
I wouldn't be surprised if you were taken off the list.
Oh, wow.
Right.
That's wonderful news. Wow, Peter, if that does that, we'll celebrate together at the Hermitage, which I always wanted to go to the Hermitage. I was actually planning a Russia trip like 5 years ago until COVID happened. But here we are. I can't return to the homeland, at least not for a while.
Well, give me a set of dates, and then the foreign ministry will have something to aim for.
Yeah, you think I'm going to trust that? I'm always worried. Like, what if I'm like flying to Istanbul or something, and the plane is diverted to Moscow? Just never getting off that plane. But okay, so let's get into it. So I guess the first thing is what were you expecting to do there, and what were your first impressions of actually being in Russia during this very transitional geopolitical moment?
Well, Moscow doesn't look any different now than it did 2 years ago, 3 years ago, before the war started. There's some recruitment posters, military recruitment posters that you might see at bus stops, but generally Moscow is thriving, and Russia does not look like a country at war unless you go to the border with Ukraine.
So are people talking about the war? Is it just something that's humming in the background? Like, Derek, I'm sure you remember, Peter, you were probably 3 years old, but in the late 2000s, 2010, 2011, like Iraq eventually became, and
3 years old
Afghanistan
in
especially.
2011. That's good.
So we only have teen. This is actually a teen podcast.
We're kind of
teen interest.
The youth magazines going.
You remember that it kind of just became a hum in the background. So is that what it's like in Russia? Are people talking about the war, or is it kind of a taboo topic? How are people addressing it?
I mean, I talk to foreign policy experts, so it is the subject of conversation explicitly. But if you're out at a bar on Friday night, then it absolutely doesn't come up.
So people don't feel like it's affecting their daily lives in any way, shape, or form.
Well, a lot of people are fighting. Quite a few have died. So if you talk to the right person, then it is a tragedy. They also might have relatives on the other side of the line. A lot of people have connections to Ukraine one way or another. So it's obviously something that is impossible to ignore. But in daily life, if you're out at a restaurant or shopping in a mall, it's not ever present. There aren't drones buzzing overhead. Occasionally one flies by. But again, it doesn't feel like a country at war. It's not quite as far away as Iraq was from the United States, but Russia is a large country, and Ukraine only neighbors a very small part of it.
What is the nature of political discussion? Because in the United States, you get this demonizing perspective in that people can't really say what they want. They can't express their own beliefs. But what is the actuality on the ground there?
I mean, in private conversations, people have latitude to more or less say what they believe and what they want. There is slightly more control over Telegram channels. That's where most of the interesting discussion takes place. but there's a huge range of opinions and quite a few fights. Those who are feistiest are probably the so-called patriots who think that Putin hasn't done nearly enough, that he should have launched this war in 2014, taken over the whole country without a bullet fired. I mean, at that point, he probably would have been welcomed with flowers and bread. And that just generally he's been too cautious the whole way through from 2014 to 2022 and every moment since then. So one guy who was this guy named Strelkov, that's his pseudonym. He was involved as kind of an adventurer in 2015, stirring up trouble in eastern Ukraine. He was going after Putin personally and all of the generals on Telegram and was eventually put in prison after months of doing this. And obviously Prigozhin marched most of the way to Moscow and then was blown out of a plane a few months later under mysterious circumstances. There are limits to criticism, but the patriotic Telegram crowd gets away with quite a lot.
I'm curious where the line gets drawn there. I mean, Prigozhin obviously, tried to march on Moscow. That's not going to happen. But for the bloggers, like for the patriot bloggers, I would imagine Putin sees getting criticism from the really pro-war crowd as somewhat liberating because it frees him up to do some things and appear maybe a little bit less extreme than some of these guys. So I guess that may be where some of the rope comes from. What is there any sense of what the red line is for the state in terms of what kind of criticism you're allowed to offer in that regard?
I think they have quite a bit of rope, but it's also because the state is not nearly as all-powerful as some people here pretend. Russia, as I mentioned before, is quite a large country, the largest in the world. And it is not simple for Putin to control single-handedly from the Kremlin. So there are different forces at work, and a lot of these Telegram channels are supported by different forces within the country that might have their own ideological or material interests. So it's a delicate game of balancing different groups internally. So again, some of them are quite hawkish. Others, there's kind of a liberal crowd that would love restoration of economic relations with the West. I don't think they believe that relations with Europe are going to be normalized anytime soon, and they're going to be back in Courchevel. Although I think Italy still gives visas to Russians, as does Switzerland.
Shout out to our Italian and Swiss brothers and sisters. So one thing I do want to ask you to kind of delineate the major political factions that you've identified, not like across the entire Russian political spectrum, but have some say in government. But what is the perspective on Ukraine? Is the notion that this is, these are essentially the same societies, these are essentially the same peoples, and what Putin is doing is just reuniting an artificial barrier that was caused to, the peculiar conditions of modernity? And if so, like, is there this idea that Ukrainians need to be Russified? I'm just curious what the far right position on that in Moscow in Russia actually is.
Well, who knows what far right means these days? Everybody's far right.
Yeah, no, but, true. Yeah. That's what I want to get to next, but you know what I mean.
I think that side would have long assumed that most of Ukraine is Russian, that the division is unnatural. And that's what Putin says and repeats in every one of his historical lectures delivered to domestic and American foreign audiences. But since the start of the war, it's been a bit more difficult to insist on that position, on eventual reunification. Most of the people who are fighting in Ukraine on both sides are Russian speakers, I suppose, originally. But the very fact of war has obviously exacerbated the divide, and I think most people in Russia have become much more militant in their desire to punish the Ukrainians. Even if they are former brothers, they've chosen the wrong side, and they need to be taught a lesson. And the front line needs to be pushed far enough that Ukraine won't pose a danger. So I think the idea that these brotherly peoples will one day reunite and triumph over some sort of, communist, Bolshevik, artificial boundaries is not something that anybody believes will take place in the near future.
So let's talk about these political factions. How would you divide what is happening within the government, or at least within that broad elite that shapes policy?
I mean, there are sort of technocrats who are dealing with the sanctions quite successfully, led by the head of the central bank, Elvira Nabiulina. She has done a very good job by all accounts. I mean, I'm not an economist, but of keeping the ruble strong, of making sure that the economy keeps humming. The Minister of Defense, he's not now in the news much, but is also sort of a technocrat after Shoigu was pushed aside. So they're the technocrats and the managers who seem to have been doing a pretty good job with the economy. There's the more hawkish crowd that wants to use the war to exert more control over society, batten down the hatches, and push away the decadent West. And then they can go after various fifth columnists at home as part of this project. And then most people are basically passive participants in this whole process. And it depends on how much money you have. Either you are benefiting from the war because defense industry is booming in certain regions, or you might have a relative who has gone to fight and gotten a fat contract, or even a bonus if he had like a leg blown off, or even bigger bonus if the guy is dead entirely. And that brings lots of money back to certain towns that hadn't seen money before at this scale. Or you're in Moscow and you're still going out to drink craft beer at breweries, get your beard trimmed at a barbershop, and you pretend none of this is happening.
And how do people view Putin? Was anyone comfortable enough to ask you about that?
Well, they don't ask me how I view Putin.
Talk to you about it, sorry.
Yeah, I mean, they're much more comfortable discussing the leadership. I mean, I go to China now every now and then. They're talking about the top leadership is not something that is comfortably done, although various doubts can be expressed about the trajectory of the country. In Russia, it's not really a taboo. Nobody's going to come swooping down on you. And there are plenty who think that he made a big mistake with starting this war. Although how that is judged, again, depends on who you're talking to. Some people, quite a few, think that the mistake is that he didn't do this early enough, that he was trying to play at politics, that he was trying to pull puppet strings with Ukrainian oligarchs, with an unsettled conflict in the East, and took a decisive measures far too late. Others think that he should have never started this war because it's a terrible tragedy and a crime and a distraction from much bigger issues, demographic ones, logistical ones. Russia has problems that this is obviously delaying solutions to.
What's the view in terms of the Western reaction to the war? And I mean, I guess we could split this into pre-Trump and post-Trump, or Biden and Trump. But, do you get the sense that people were surprised at how the U.S. and Europe kind of reacted so strongly to the invasion? Or, are they past that now? Maybe, I don't know if you've had discussions about, going all the way back, like, were you expecting this level of response, or what's sort of the overall view of that?
The Europeans surprised them. So the Russians believed that the Europeans were controlled more or less by the Americans, that wonderful, harmonious Russian-European relations had not been established only because of American imperial interests. And so they were shocked by the extent to which the Europeans cut ties overnight and went much farther than the Americans in many respects. In Germany, the pendulum swung very far from any kind of residual Ostpolitik to rampant, Russophobia, I suppose, is one way to put it. And the Russians were not expecting that. And so they have written off the Europeans as constructive partners totally. The problem is that now that there's an American outreach, they don't necessarily believe that Trump can deliver on Europe or Ukraine. That Kiev might not have very many cards, but Trump doesn't have all that many levers he can pull unless he totally abandons Europe and Kiev. And even in that scenario, Russia believes that Europe and Ukraine will try to keep the fight going for a while and won't relax sanctions and so forth. And most of the sanctions are European sanctions. the ones that really bite.
Right. So that, I mean, I guess that leads then to, the question about like what's the impression of Trump. And while you were there, I mean, this thing shifted quite a bit from, Trump sort of uh, having arguments in the Oval Office with Zelensky and, kind of blaming Ukrainian intransigence for not being able to get a deal done to, he and Zelensky met on the sidelines of the Pope's funeral. And now it's all Putin's, leading me on, and he is not interested in peace. And he seems more frustrated with the Russians. Do they like the mercurial aspect of Trump, I guess, how much does that come up? And just overall, what's the sense of where this might be heading under Trump trying to mediate things?
Right. So under Biden, the Russians referred to what they called the collective West. Now they understand that there's a rupture within the West, but they don't quite believe in the Trump transformation. There's a sense, I mean, I was in Russia in February, and then just a couple weeks ago, both visits coincided with Witkoff visits. The first time I was there in February, not the first time, I was there at various stages throughout the war, but the first time since Trump's election, coincided with Vance's speech in Munich, Witkoff's first visit, and then I was in Russia recently when Witkoff was there. And there's clearly an understanding that American politics have shifted. But one reaction to Vance's speech in Munich, other than Schadenfreude, was that the U.S. empire might just be more sort of nakedly pursuing its interests rather than the sort of pious hypocrisy that had prevailed previously. I tried to tell them that there was a serious paradigm shift, real retrenchment of American empire, of reframing of transatlantic relations that goes beyond, a naked attempt to grab resources in Russia's near abroad. That the change in rhetoric is matched by like an actual change in the extent to which the United States is pursuing its interests in the world. There's also a sense that Trump might be a fleeting political phenomenon, that he'll lose the Republican Party will lose the midterm elections. He'll be chased out in 4 years, and that'll be the end of it. That it'll be like the Obama reset, that there was an outreach to Russia, but that was a sort of a fleeting political flash in the pan. Again, I think that that's a misjudgment on their end, because whatever happened under Obama with Hillary Clinton bringing a big red button to Moscow is not what Trump is doing. And that no liberal internationalist restoration is really in the cards, because even some kind of Ezra Klein is talking about abundance within the bounds of the United States. So U.S. aid is gone. The National Endowment of Democracy is gone. Radio Free Europe, I don't know if it's still hanging on institutionally, but there clearly has been a big change. But the Russians are skeptical.
This is probably a silly question, but actually, this is the week that I taught my students Kennan. So I was reading a lot about the neurotic Russian approach to international relations. And as you know, Peter, as a Cold War historian, ultimately in your bones, Kennan has this theory related to traditional Russian insecurity about its near abroad. And he's basically like, that's really what they care about. They would like to exert influence on the global stage, but it is ultimately this near abroad that defines them. So as someone who spent a few years thinking about this, talking with Russian foreign policy makers and decision makers, could you actually give a layout of what is the, broadly speaking, Russian approach to the world in the way that, I could about the United States' pursuit of primacy? Because I think there's a lot of misunderstanding in this country about Russia wanting to be the global hegemon. I mean, I'm skeptical that the Soviet Union wanted to be the global hegemon, let alone the Russian Federation in the 2020s. So what do you take to be, put on your Kennan fedora and tell me what is the Russian understanding of the world, and particularly what is the Russian understanding of its security interests and environment?
Well, few countries have a worldview as easy to describe, though probably ultimately incoherent as the Americans. So I don't know if I have a simple answer for you. Stalin obviously did not want to take over the world. He told the French and Italian communist parties to stand down, to just cause trouble, but not take over in the immediate aftermath of the war. And now the idea that Putin has puppets and fifth columnists strewn around the Western world is obviously overblown. So world domination is not the Russian endgame. There clearly is a historical sense of insecurity on the Western borders. And Ukraine is a particular problem, with Belarus is like a delayed problem that may blow up at some point that they're worried about. Ukraine, because it is that flat land that has been crossed many times before, from Napoleon to Hitler, but also because it is Russian Orthodox and sort of culturally the same in many respects and in many parts up until 2014, and then slowly changing into a national project based on opposition to Russia ever since. And if that can progress in Ukraine, then it could have political outcomes in Russia that aren't great for the regime. And that isn't the caricature that you hear in Washington, D.C., that like a thriving democracy in Ukraine is obviously a problem for Putin. But a regime that is sort of anti-Russian in its essence on Russia's border in a country of 40 million is obviously a security problem. And then a country that is not yet in NATO, but on the path to NATO with CIA installations in NATO equipment accumulating year after year, that is absolutely a security problem and was considered a security problem in Moscow. So that's why it's not so easy for Trump to just declare an end to the war, have the golden domes stop blowing up and the beautiful bodies stop falling down.
Did he say
because
that?
This is a security. I mean, yeah, he's like the golden domes, I suppose, are falling and the beautiful bodies
That
were
is wild.
exploding.
He has a way with language, man. Like AI can't do that.
Yeah, so I think until the Russians believe that they've solved this security problem, they're not going to stop, or they'll stop and then wait for a time to solve the problem sometime down the line.
Is there any? I mean, I would make this argument, and I'm curious if you encountered anybody who would make this argument that the talk of Ukraine in NATO and having European soldiers in Ukraine, like even going that far, having European troops stationed there, like the war advanced all of that to some degree. The war is probably the reason why Finland is now in NATO. Otherwise they, didn't seem to have that much interest in joining. So you've brought in on another front, a country with a long land border with Russia that's now a NATO member seemingly as a direct result of the decision to invade Ukraine. I wonder, does anybody think about it in those terms in Russia?
Why, you certainly encountered it in Washington under Biden's administration. That was their line, that Putin has already failed because he has brought NATO closer to his borders. He has made Ukraine more anti-Russian, consolidated the entire West against him. Clearly, the war did not work out the way that Putin had planned. They did think that it was a special military operation, not a massive World War I style war, like a World War II blitzkrieg. That wasn't, I think, the plan. The plan was to immediately enact regime change in Kiev, for the Russian flag to fly in cities along the way. They thought they had purchased all the right oligarchs, mayors, and generals, and they probably had, but a few dominoes didn't fall, a few key figures didn't turn, and it didn't work out. And clearly the Americans also thought that it was an operation that was probably going to succeed in a matter of 6 days. So the fact that they ended up with a massive war on their border, that they're chewing through their shrinking population, is not a strategic win for Russia. Given the sunk cost, there are many in Russia who believe that it's all the more important now to solve this problem definitively, because if they don't, they're going to end up with Kashmir in the best case scenario, and we see how that's working out for India and Pakistan. So that's why a ceasefire probably is not in Russia's interest in the immediate term, and they're probably willing to pay a significant cost to deal with this problem as they see it more or less definitively. That doesn't mean that they're not ready for peace. I mean, there are a lot of people in Moscow who want to come to terms with Trump, who would like to seize on this opportunity to draw a big red line somewhere through Ukraine and past Belarus. And if Finland and so forth are now in NATO, so be it. The Baltic countries already were. And to get back to Danny's question about Kennan and Russian Soviet strategic culture, in many ways, all they really want is that bright red line. Churchill's percentages agreement, Yalta, Helsinki, that's what they want. They want the NATO open door to close, and they want a line where they know that we're on this side and you're on that side. And that line wasn't there before, with the insistence on NATO's door always being open and color revolutions perhaps in the offing somewhere in the Caucasus and Belarus and all along Russia's perimeter. So I think if a thick red line were drawn somewhere, then Russia would feel more comfortable. And that line can be quite close to their borders. It already is in some respect. So the question is where it ends up going through Ukraine. And it has to be beyond Belarus, I would imagine.
I mean, that you're leading into what my next question was going to be, which is, what do people envision in terms of finally settling this conflict? The contours of what Trump is offering have become clear over the past few weeks, which is recognition of Crimea, de facto recognition, but not formal recognition of the mainland Ukrainian territory, which leads to the Kashmir situation, it seems to me. It leads to this open kind of open-ended, low-level conflict that you see India and Pakistan engaged in. The guarantee that Ukraine will never be invited into NATO, which I don't think the Russians can believe, can they? Like, is there any mechanism that could be put in place that they could believe a future U.S. president wouldn't undo, or that NATO wouldn't just go back on? I mean, we can go back to the 90s and the discussions over, don't worry, we're not going to come east of, East Germany, and then oopsie, look at what we did. Like, there's no history of trust there. There's no history on which to base any kind of trust. On top of which, you have to look at the political system in the U.S. and think, this could be just a wild swing from one president to another. So I'm curious what anybody's talking about in terms of like an assurance that this line's going to stay where it is, or that that Ukraine's never going to get into NATO. Like, how do you guarantee that stuff?
Well, I think you probably have been in Moscow recently, because you do a very good job of conveying the Russian
I'm just very empathetic.
I haven't been to Moscow, Peter. I haven't been to Moscow.
Well, as we mentioned at the top, I think that can probably be arranged. If you express a strong desire to go, I think the mark next to your name will be removed.
They'll have to find a new B professor to replace you on the alphabetical list of professors who got sanctioned, but we can find somebody.
So yeah, the NATO thing is obviously a problem. And that's why, like, the formal status of Finland or whatever is not really the issue. And why, so Ukraine cannot be in NATO at the end of this war, because that was an explicit part of Putin's war speech and sort of war objectives at the outset, is that Ukraine shouldn't be in NATO. So that, I suppose, is not something that Russia would stomach in the near term. But the NATO status or not NATO status is not the essential strategic problem, because Ukraine was getting more and more incorporated into the Western military and intelligence structures before the war, and that was very bad as far as Russian strategists were concerned. So that is the essential issue. So you can envision an endgame where the Russians push far enough that they are comfortable with everything beyond this very clear line being fully incorporated into the West. But that would probably require pushing the line farther than it is now, unless they're totally exhausted, which they don't seem to be at the moment. Or Ukraine would have to be effectively neutralized. Russia would have to be able to monitor that. And there would have to be limits on Western military integration. And Ukraine would have to then be able to supply its own defense. And that would be something that Russia would monitor. So if the political preferences in the West change, if they do decide to incorporate Ukraine, Russia would have an obvious veto on this because they would have a military card to play. I mean, that's why it's always funny when the West would insist that Russia has no say in how far NATO expands. I mean, obviously they do. They can start a war.
Right.
That's
So I want to move a little bit beyond Ukraine and get into some bigger picture stuff that maybe people are talking about in Russia. You get a lot here about the end of unipolarity and the multipolar world and the return of great power competition, or now under Trump, great power coercion and spheres of influence. What's the discussion in terms of geopolitics in Russia and where Russia fits in the world moving forward?
Yeah, well, multipolar world is a phrase that they've liked for a while. Global majority is another concept that was coined by a guy I know actually over there, which is supposed to refer to the fact that the majority of the world population is not part of the Western Bloc, and this is sort of evidenced by the UN voting patterns, that those who voted to condemn Russia might represent sort of a plurality of countries in the world, but not a majority of the population. So I think Russia, they more or less sincerely believe that the West is losing relative power and that Europe in particular is a mess and that its 500-year reign is coming to a close and that China, but not only China, India, Indonesia, and so forth, are the East is rising, that sort of thing. I think they believe more or less sincerely. That doesn't mean that they wouldn't want working relations with the U.S., and Trump's offer of normalization is very tempting. But for most of Russian history, the West, Europe, was the sole source of technology, funds, and that created friction, but also this constant desire to do something with the West ultimately. And now I think they have realized, somewhat to their surprise, that the world is big, that China, India, Africa, the Middle East are open for business and will remain open for business. And so they've kind of sought to rediscover old Soviet ties, and have found that there are Africans who are still in power who went to school in the Soviet Union and remember them fondly, that there are plenty of people in India who grew up reading Soviet textbooks and, again, remember the Soviet Union's position relative to India for many years. So it takes some work in Russia because they have gone through, 20 years of neoliberalism where all they wanted was to join the WTO and go on vacation in Davos and Courchevel. But they are attempting to reactivate these old sort of Soviet solidarities, more or less successfully in some places.
So this leads to my question. So I'm working through this idea that Fukuyama was in some sense right and in some sense wrong. He was right that political economic alternatives to capitalism really didn't come into being, but he was wrong that it would be liberalism that would itself triumph, that the type of economic liberalization represented by something like joining the WTO would inevitably lead to a form of political liberalization. So this is leading me to believe that this is actually the moment of the end of ideology, not in the sense that Daniel Bell meant it in 1960, when he basically meant like a mixed form of social democratic capitalism in the United States, or not the end of history in which Fukuyama meant in the terms of liberalism's triumph, broad, capaciously defined liberalism, but in the sense that ideology just matters a lot less. to how states think of themselves and how they interact in the world. So I was wondering what you think of that proposition when it comes to Russia, because even when you're talking about rebuilding Soviet solidarities, it's along power relation lines. It's not like we're going to help India do X or Y fascist thing or liberal thing or communist thing. We're just going to like rebuild power relationships so we could have mutually beneficial security and economic exchanges. So what do you think of that claim with Russia, or is there an actual ideology governing? Just one final thing. The closest thing I do think is like who's that far right guy that ever Dugin, right? Like this sort of like far right thing, but that seems like kind of just not that powerful or like not that serious in the terms of its causal effect on Russian relations, foreign policy, what have you. So ideology, and is there one in Russia or not really?
It's mostly fake. I was in Moscow, I don't know, 10 years ago, and David Remnick came to write an essay about Dugin and various other gray cardinals who were trying to create a horrible Russia that would come and strangle the world. And I think in many ways, the U.S. created the monster that it feared through writing essays like that. Dugin is obviously more powerful now than he was then, but he's still basically a marginal figure, an eccentric, somebody that most people would dismiss in Russia itself. And he won't matter as soon as this war is over. And I think you're basically right that the idea that Russia is some sort of conservative Christian homeland is a total fabrication, and one that, again, is in some sense, a product of American fantasy. When Tucker Carlson goes to interview Putin and asks him what it's like to be the leader of a Christian country, Putin immediately responded with some reference to Russian tolerance of Islam, because they have to keep a lid on that. Like, that is the actual religious center of Russia in many respects, is like the Muslim immigrant community and native Muslim population. There's, I don't know, you walk around Moscow, everybody's got these nasty inflated duck lips. It is absolutely not some sort of conservative Christian nation that is resisting Western decay and decadence. And the same thing basically is true in China. All these malls are identical. Modernity is identical. Telephones are identical. If we end up in
this is the end of ideology.
Yeah,
I'm working on a big piece
blocks
like this right now. I completely agree. Capitalism triumphed, and different forms of capitalism triumphs, but like there's no liberalism barely matters, let alone an alternative to liberalism like people are claiming exists in China and Russia.
Yeah, I agree for the most part. I mean, we'll see if something emerges, but it turned out liberalism itself was an ideology that was connected to capitalism, but not identical to it. So whatever liberalism has become in its very strange last few years has created, I don't know, resistance elsewhere. But yeah, essentially, it seems like we're all working our way to AI and
utopia,
sort of. Exactly. And Russia's no different in that respect, of course.
And so how does Russia then view itself like on the global stage? The Soviet Union, as you've studied, obviously has like had like a particular vision of what it was trying to do in the world. Is there really nothing there right now for Russia? It's to achieve security. It's to develop internally, blah, blah, blah. But as you know, in the 20th century, everyone's really concerned with guiding history, capital H, in a particular direction. And I think there's still remnants of that actually in this country. But there's none of that in Russia.
And Peter, just to kind of piggyback on that, I'm curious if there's any discussion specifically of what Russia is trying to do via BRICS. You get a lot of talk here, like BRICS is the thing that's going to break the Western financial system. It's going to break the dollar. They're going to have their own payment system. I'm very skeptical of all of this. I wonder what the vision is for that piece of it specifically in Russia.
I think, BRICS is probably limited. If the U.S. continues to try to strangle nations it doesn't like through sanctions, then ultimately alternative financial mechanisms will be discovered by BRICS and anybody else who wants to join, because they'll have no other option. But if the U.S. relaxes pressure somewhat, then I think the dollar will remain or gold, I suppose, the easiest ways to store value. So that is totally a reactive measure. And every country that wants to join BRICS is doing it as an insurance policy, an attempt to find some avenue in case the U.S. has it out for them at some point. And I think Russia's view of the world is essentially pragmatic, one based on sovereignty, which is a convenient category for Russia because it's really big. They obviously want to incorporate a sliver west and might have designs elsewhere, but generally speaking, sovereignty works well for a country as large as Russia, works well enough for China. So sovereignty, I suppose, is the key category. Multipolarity in the sense that they want an alternative to American hegemony. But that's, again, not really a positive project. If you ask Russians to define what that really means, they will probably struggle, certainly have no answer to the question of what those poles are and how many exist. I think pragmatism is a big issue. It's like Erdogan, Putin gets along with. Russia and Turkey, Russia and the Ottoman Empire have a very long and complex history filled with war. Erdogan pulls in different directions all the time. But generally, Russia and Turkey find one another to be partners that sort of work together because there is a sense that each side is advancing selfish interest, and that when those interests align, they can get along. When they don't, they conflict. And I think that's basically Russia's vision of the world, is just a bunch of cynical pragmatists, each advancing national interest, sometimes in alignment, other times in tension.
Do they have any theory of, like, let's be specific, let's talk about the United States. Do they have any theory of like what that national interest is or who is determining it? Or do they just think it's a bunch of, like Russia, wealthy people who have influence and control of the state? Or like, how do they envision what national interest is, at least when it comes to the United States? Like, what do they think the U.S.'s national interest is and who's controlling it?
I mean, it depends who we're talking about in Russia, but the simple answer is that they generally overemphasize material interests of elites. And this may be an inheritance of the old Soviet ideology. So there was long a sense that when American politicians talk about human rights and LGBT and so forth, what they really have in mind is the advancement of their material interests, attempts to control resources, and to, find new ways to spread their influence in Russia's near abroad. So they did not believe for a second in the sort of value proposition and the fact that Americans could somehow combine a belief in certain liberal values with an advancement of material interests. They always thought that one was a cover for the other. And this led them to misplay their hand terribly in Ukraine because, again, they made their bet on oligarchs. Same thing in Syria. They thought that they had a relationship with Assad. Everything was fine. And then he fell and they had no idea what was happening in the society beneath them. So they have a basic understanding that sort of if you have a relationship with the elites, you've got a key to the entirety of society.
Kind of building off of that, what is Russia's view of China, and how would you say this new axis of evil is collaborating to destroy the U.S. leadership that has brought the world to such a fine place?
The Russians are not entirely happy to be quite as dependent on China as they are, although they are not as dependent on China as Americans might believe. I had some economist in Moscow tell me that trade with Europe was 50% of Russian turnover before the war, and it's 30% now with China, and it's quite large with India and Turkey, although someplace like Turkey is not just Turkey, it's filtering European goods and so on. But I think strategically, Russia believes that the relationship with China is important and necessary going forward. They are very proud of having, on both sides of the Russia-Chinese relationship, of having resolved the border disputes that had plagued the relationship since first contact in like the 16th century. And that, in Putin's early years of his rule, was progressively resolved. So there are no border disputes between Russia and China. That is very important for both countries because they have such problems at the other end. Russia in the West, China in the South China Sea with India and so forth. Russia also believes that China is the source of technology going forward. Perhaps not the only source, but a very important one. So I don't think that they're going to split from China in some reverse Kissinger. That is absolutely absurd. But of course, they would like to be able to pivot whichever way they like, depending on interest and opportunity. So they're not going to join China in an anti-American bloc, certainly not Iran and North Korea. The idea that that's an axis is absurd. One of the reasons that Russia is interested in a relationship with North Korea is to be able to use that as leverage against China. And if North Korea has a relationship with Russia, then it's not entirely dependent on China. That is something that Russia can use in its relationship with China. It's also something that it can use in its relationship with South Korea. And South Korea is extremely excited at the opportunity of returning to the Russian market as soon as the U.S. decides to relax secondary sanctions so that Hyundai can get back in there and compete with the Chinese brands that now make up 70% of the Russian market.
If only I could purchase a BYD, things would be okay.
You would finally have built your dream.
I would finally have built my goddamn dream. Derek, I know you had a question. Go for it.
Yeah, I think, maybe we're sort of at a point where we should wrap up. And I guess the question that kind of lingers out there, and that I'm curious if there's any discussion of in Russia, is what's the succession plan? Like, Putin is not old, certainly not by U.S. standards, but he's not young either. And it's not clear to me that there's an obvious candidate to step in as a sort of heir apparent or the next guy up. What is there any conversation on this going on in Russia? Like, what are you hearing, if anything?
Well, they haven't started building another mausoleum yet, so it's unclear where he would even go. So I suppose he has to stay for now.
He should double up with Lenin.
Well, Stalin already bunked with Lenin and didn't last very long, so maybe that's not
True,
the
only
most
3
comfortable
years.
position. There are a lot of young people in the system now. Like, many of the deputy ministers are in their 40s. There's kind of a gap between the 70-year-olds you see on TV and the people who are actually doing a lot of the work. So there is another generation that is waiting in the wings that will play a very important role when the Putin-Lavrov crowd pass from the scene. And we'll probably end up with a very different Russia. Obviously not the liberal Russia of 1990s fantasy, but something that is very different from the one now that is ruled by elites formed in the late Soviet period and have a very peculiar vision of the world as a result. Who in particular will replace Putin is entirely unclear. There are, again, as I said before, technocrats who are very capable, who exert considerable influence over how the machine actually operates day to day. There's also a program now in place that is trying to select cadres from among military veterans. That's a highly publicized project. There are various military veterans who have already been appointed to like vice gubernatorial roles, made mayors of various cities, put in like the ministerial pipeline. So you could easily end up, whether it's like Putin's replacement or some future minister, with somebody who has medals on his chest and tales of, I don't know, Pokrovsk in his bio.
So, all right, Peter, before we go, do you have any final thoughts or anything you want to leave our audience with, or you feel perfectly fulfilled, like you've reached a type of nirvana after this interview?
Yeah, well, Nirvana is not the state that I search for generally. I'm more of a rambunctious than a calm character. So, despite some of these awkward silences.
So that's perfect. Well, Peter, thank you so much for joining us. Everyone, check out the Trilog podcast. Check out Peter's work. He actually has the introductory essay in the forthcoming Cold War Liberalism volume that you will all be hearing about very soon. And Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you, guys.